Okay, well, I think we're good to go, John. So, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, known as CAPI, at the University of Victoria. For those of you who don't know me, and I think there are many who may not, I'm CAPI's director, Victor Ramraj. And if you're joining a CAPI event for the first time, we're a dynamic interdisciplinary Asia-focused research center located in Victoria, BC, on Canada's west coast and on Coast Salish territory. I'm truly honored to have been asked to moderate this session. I'm grateful to Jordan and Mike for the tremendous work that they've been doing on the Landscapes of Injustice project, which we've been privileged to host and house at CAPI. I saw a very nice note about the conclusion of the project. Some of you might have received that on email yesterday, and a great tribute to our colleague Mike Abbey. So it was lovely to see that, and it really has been a privilege for CAPI to host this project. And I'd also like to say that I'm delighted that there's a prospect of a second project, Past Wrongs, Future Choices, of which this event is a part. And so on behalf of my colleagues at CAPI, as well as our colleagues at the Center for Global Studies, our sister center, it's really a privilege to host this event here on the UVic campus. And of course in cyberspace. So on that note, since I'm here on the campus today, let me take a moment to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory our university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wissanich peoples whose historical relationships to the land and the waters around us continue to this day. Today we have five terrific researchers and less than an hour and a half. So I'm going to be very brief with my introductions, and then I'm going to invite the speakers to say a few words about their professional background as it relates to the larger Past Wrongs, Future Choices project, and this particular sub aspect on the legal dimensions. And I'll then invite Jordan to say a few words about the project before asking each of the speakers to take a slightly deeper dive into their research as it connects to these legal issues. So again, with apologies for the brevity, I will just introduce our speakers by name and affiliation. We have Eric Adams from the University of Alberta Law School. We have Jessica A. Fernandez de Lara Harada from Cambridge University. We have Masumi Izumi from Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. And I should just note that Masumi is joining us only passively. She won't be able to participate directly, but I did have a chance to meet her a couple of days earlier, and we recorded her introduction and her remarks. So I will play those remarks at the appropriate time. We also have Eric Mueller, who is based at the University of North Carolina Law School, and Rainer Thwaites from the University of Sydney Law School. So a truly international panel. I'm surprised that we were able to figure out the time zones, but terrific that we did. So welcome to you all, to CAPI, and of course to our terrific audience from around the world. And in the order in which I introduced you, could I ask you to now take a couple of minutes to tell us your background, and in particular to situate your professional background in terms of what you hope to bring to this session. So with that, Eric, may I turn it over to you for 2 minutes?
Thanks, Victor, and thanks to everyone for coming. It's terrific to see lots of familiar faces and to read lots of familiar names on the Zoom screen. I'm beaming to you from Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland, Edmonton, Alberta, where I work at the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. I'm a law professor here. I'm a lawyer, and I think if I've understood the framing question correctly from Victor, what has brought me to this particular study and interest in Japanese Canadian legal history in Canada. And I come to it as a constitutional historian primarily, who's interested in how Canada has fashioned and recreated and is in always the perpetual process of working out our constitutional relations. And I'm interested in the process of those constitutional relations building, in particular in relation to the rights discourse. Who has rights? What are those rights? And how does the state recognize them? And in Canada, in my view, one of the central and dominant and most influential and important constitutional stories of the 20th century was the historical experience of Japanese Canadians. Both the constitutional wrongs that were done to Japanese Canadians, especially in the 1940s, but also the legacy of those wrongs and how they impacted and, in my view, changed Canadian constitutional culture. So those are all my interests, and I hope to talk more about them as we continue our remarks.
Super. Thanks very much, Eric. And I realize I have to distinguish the Erics. So thank you, Eric Adams. And now may I turn it to Jessica.
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this discussion. My doctoral research develops an understanding of the historical experience of Japanese immigrants and their descendants in Mexico across 5 generations. It examines the historical and contemporary practices of state and everyday racism. I analyze individual and collective experiences in relation to dominant discourses of the Mexican nation, race, and citizenship. These discourses are defined by mestizaje, a racial regime of white assimilation that reproduces inequalities and the suppression of the historical experience of people of Japanese origin from dominant academic, government, and popular accounts. Mestizaje is a socio-historical formation rooted in Iberian colonialism and US imperialism in the Americas. It is a racial mixture project premised on the replacement of indigenous peoples, the appropriation of slave and immigrant labor, and the government and control of resources by Ibero-American mestizo elites. As such, mestizaje is a settler colonial structure that relies on genocide, ethnocide, and dispossession of non-white groups. Historically, mestizaje developed as an elite discourse that marginalized and excluded Asian peoples from belonging to the nation, despite being one of the fastest growing groups at different periods in Mexican history. My research is connected to the work of fellow panelists as it seeks to elucidate the mechanisms by which the war concentration system operated from its orchestration and execution in the mid-20th century to its legacies. It sheds light on the participation and complicity of state and non-state actors and the importance of struggles for justice that connect the histories of Mexican Japanese with other excluded ethno-racial minoritarian groups in the Asia-Pacific Americas. Finally, my personal history as a descendant of Fukuokan immigrants from my mother's side and of Black indigenous Mexicans from my father's side has driven my interest in writing these histories of racism to combat inequalities and injustices in Mexico and beyond. I am happy to discuss more details about this work with you later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And now I'll just play my previous recording of my interview with Masumi. Just make sure that this is working. Okay.
Yes, so my name is Masumi Izumi. I am teaching North American history and culture at the Faculty of Global and Regional Studies at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. And I'm a historian of Japanese American and Japanese Canadians. So I'm not really like a legal scholar, but I have done a lot of legal research in my study and research and writing about the Japanese American and Japanese Canadian history, because a lot of the issues that I deal with, it's focused on the wartime experiences of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. So when the earlier project, the landscape of injustice started, I was sort of consulted as a Japan-based scholar who is studying about Japanese Canadians, because there is also like this study of the immigration from Japan part, and also this issue of how to integrate the immigration history from Japan into the Japanese Canadian, the study of Japanese Canadian historical experiences. So that's how I got involved in the landscape of injustice project, but also because I have looked at the legal aspect of the wartime treatment of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. I dealt with the American experience in my dissertation, and also that came out as a book. And also I looked at the Canadian legal aspect, legal history that is related to Japanese Canadian uprooting and incarceration. So so that's how I'm both kind of involved in the legal study cluster of the project, but I'm also involved in the archival cluster of the project.
That's great.
Yes, so yeah, that's why I guess I'm here.
Okay, and so let's turn it over now to Eric Mueller for his introduction. Eric?
Hi, everybody. Greetings from North Carolina on the East Coast of the United States. I wanted, like Jessica, I wanted to extend my thanks to Cappy and to Jordan and Mike and everyone involved with bringing this together. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to connect with people all around the world who share significant interests about very important chapters in their national and also global history. So I've been focusing my scholarship on the story of the incarceration of Japanese Americans since the late 1990s. It's really been the mainstay of what I have researched and written about. And I think that's why I'm here. My first really sort of major entry into the field was through a legal history portal. I wrote a book about the criminal prosecutions of young men in the American concentration camps who were prosecuted for resisting the military draft at the time in 1943 and 1944 when it was brought into effect for the people incarcerated. My next major contribution, I guess you'd say, to the field is really indicative of where my interests really have ended up staying. And that is having to do with questions about how these systems actually run. Not so much how they're designed by the handful of people at the very top of government, but by how they're carried forward and carried through by dozens, hundreds, even thousands of ordinary people who many of whom may have pangs of conscience about what they're doing, maybe even doubt or don't believe in the necessity or legality of the program that they're helping to operate, but who nonetheless show up to work every day and carry the program forward, telling themselves some kind of story about how they're doing some good, and that they're well-meaning, and but simultaneously, obviously, being essential to the administration of an unjust program. I guess so I wrote a book about the bureaucracy that was created to adjudicate the loyalties or the supposed loyalties of Japanese Americans. And my current project, which I'll say a little bit more about later, has to do with the lawyers who were staffing the individual concentration camps and helping them to run. The only other thing I'll mention is that my own portal into this, my own position, you might say, is I am a son and son-in-law as well of refugees and victims of the Holocaust. And so grew up with stories about the internal scapegoating of a minority group, very much as part of my own family story. And so Japanese American history has always felt adjacent to, although not my own personal story. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. And last but not least, Rainer Thwaites in Sydney. Rainer?
Hello all. I'm beaming to you from Sydney, which the University of Sydney is on Gadigal land, and I give my respects to elders past, present and future. My contributing specialisation or expertise is on the legal status of citizenship and nationality and its flux and change over time in not all, but some of the countries under study and internationally. So I'm with the Sydney Law School, but over recent years and sort of at present, moving increasingly into legal history. My doctorate was on an area where citizenship status or its lack has heightened significance, immigration detention. And since sort of writing on immigration detention, although I still publish on that, I increasingly focus on citizenship status itself, sort of its vulnerability, and issues, focusing on how it may be lost and why. And other themes of my scholarship that are relevant, legal responses to national security, and the sort of complex and ubiquitous relationship between international and domestic law. Probably most immediately relevantly for this project, with two colleagues, I'm currently working on an Australian Research Council project for 2021 to 2024, which is centred on key Australian citizenship cases from about 120 years ago to the present, understood as claims for belonging. So we're analysing how claims to membership were understood at the time, legally and extra-legally, by the litigants, the government and the public. And so far our research has taken us to the National Archive, to sort of court files as archive, and other publicly available materials. For Past Wrongs, Future Choices, I hope to bring knowledge of the longue durée of changes on citizenship and nationality to better contextualise and draw out specificities and continuities in the treatment of Nikkei in the 1940s. And not for now, but just sort of in my contribution to the panel today, I really want to focus on a subset of the Nikkei in Australia, those who are natural born or naturalised as British subjects in Australia, and how the particular legal statuses and the law at the time both enabled a racialised response, but also was in tension with it. And lastly, just to say I'm honoured and very glad to be part of the discussion today, but I'll end there.
And thanks, Rainer, and thanks to all of you. I'm really excited to see where this discussion goes, and I can take zero credit for inviting you all. That lies with Jordan and Mike, and I'm just really honored to be able to sort of shepherd the discussion. But before I do, Jordan, may I ask you to maybe say a few words about either the project or this specific aspect of it and what you're hoping that we'll achieve today. So over to you, Jordan.
Thanks, Victor, and to Cappy. And I probably don't need to say much more to get the audience excited about what the panelists have to say, because those were quite intriguing introductions, I think, and I'll not use much time therefore. But I will just say that in the course of doing 8 years of research on the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians, comparative questions were frequently asked of us, and in particular, questions about the comparison between, as is often the case in Canada, Canada and the United States. And as we answer those questions as best we could, I think those of us on the project, me included, were aware that we weren't expert to answer these comparative questions, and that the historiography, that clearly the internment of Japanese Canadians was connected with internments elsewhere, and that there'd be value in connecting with people who had expertise to speak to those. Simultaneous with that, Nikkei organizations, museums, and archives in particular have been reaching out, perhaps for similar reasons, across national origins and so national locations. And so we've had the opportunity over the last year to be in conversation with scholars like these and organizations in countries where Nikkei people were interned in the 1940s. And as Victor mentioned, we have a grant application, but about which we hope to hear soon. But the neat trick we've pulled is to get these folks to talk to each other, so that even if we're not lucky enough to get the grant, we'll have benefited from conversations like this. And so I'm really looking forward to doing so along with the audience today.
Great, thanks very much, Jordan. And based on my previous discussions with Jordan, I think he used the expression of building a research community, and I think there's a really great opportunity for that here. So as I turn the floor over to the participants, I just encourage you to look for those connections. I'm sure you're already seeing them, but to maybe so that we can then take the conversation forward after you've been able to showcase a little bit of your own research. And then I will say that we won't have exactly a traditional question and answer period, time allowing, but what I would ask those of you in the audience to think about is to also look for those connections, and maybe when the time comes, maybe you could sort of help us to tease them out and to see where there might be overlapping interests or questions that come out of the collective of presentations. So with that, I'm going to make a slight change in the order of the presentations versus the introductions. What I think I'll do is I'll leave Masumi's recorded presentation for the end of the session, because I gave her a little bit extra latitude since she won't be involved in the intra-panel discussion. So we'll go with Eric Adams, and then Jessica, and then Eric Mueller, and then Rainer, and then I'll play the recorded session with Masumi. So with that, Eric, can I invite you to take a slightly deeper dive into your research as it connects to these legal historical issues?
Thanks, Victor. I'll do so, I guess, by talking about, in the Canadian context, where I've been studying this in the Landscapes of Injustice project for the last decade or so. I think it's right that amongst all the stories of Nikkei peoples in Canada, there are many ways to think about that experience and its impacts. So I don't for a minute want people to think that the law or the legal story is the most important or the most dominant even, or the most relevant to people's lives. It may or may not be, but it is the story that I know the most about, and it's the one I've studied. So that's the one I'm going to talk about. And I think in a good legal history, there are ways in which the law should and must touch upon the lives of real people, but that a legal history doesn't need to push out and displace other important social histories or experiences that come from those that suffered these harms. When I then turn to the idea of, well, what is the legal history of the constitutional wrongs, as I'll call it, of Japanese Canadians, I think the Landscapes of Injustice project was good at identifying in the Canadian experience that there was a cascade, and I think that metaphor is a useful one, a cascade of events from the uprooting and dislocation to the internment and incarceration to the dispossession of property, culminating in the exile of Japanese Canadians after the war. And that each of those legal wrongs was produced through law. And each of them was, in a sense, related to one another. I think the Landscapes of Injustice book correctly argues that in some ways, each next step was an attempt to try and solve problems that the earlier step had created. And each of those placed Japanese Canadians in increasingly precarious and vulnerable positions to state power. And I'll be interested to learn more about Rayner's work, because the culmination of that state power was in fact indeed the stripping of citizenship of Japanese Canadians as part of the Exile project. So I think all of those, again, legal wrongs are significant. Each of them has their own particular stories and dynamics to them. And I'll talk a little bit today about the one that I'm writing a book on currently, which is the exile of Japanese Canadians. What is also significant is that in two of those legal wrongs, we produced a case, a constitutional challenge to the wrong itself. So Japanese Canadians, sometimes in partnership with others, challenged the legality of the dispossession of their property in a case called Nakashima and Canada. And they challenged the exile of Japanese Canadians in 1946, a case that ended up in then Canada's highest court, which was a British court, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which ultimately determined that case. And here I'll maybe borrow a little from what I've learned about Eric Mueller and the little bit that I know about the American experience. But what's interesting, and in some ways a contrast in the United States, was the prominence of American litigation about the Japanese American incarceration, which resulted in particularly a set of famous cases. Maybe the most famous, Eric will correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the most famous of those, a case called Korematsu, which is still being discussed and taught and cited, and it played a role in the Trump presidency. It continues to carry this constitutional cultural relevance in American law. Some scholars have identified the Korematsu case as a charter member of something called the anti-canon in American jurisprudence. I'd be interested in Eric's thoughts about whether that's a useful construct or not. But the idea not that there are important cases that we look to in our constitutional tradition as guiding posts, shining lights of liberty, but there are in fact these anti-canon cases that are significant for their wrongness. That is, their most important feature is in reminding us how wrong the law can be, the damage that states can produce in the lives of its people, and the way that the legal process might participate in those wrongs by, say, sanctioning them. Now it's time for the contrast. So in Canada, I argue, we have no anti-canon. We have these two cases, Nakashima and Canada. We have the exile case, but they lie, I argue, almost completely in shadow. In Canada, we do not use those cases as an anti-canon. We do not use those cases to stand for a moment of constitutional wrongness to learn from. Rather, we don't engage with them at all. I had a brother that was 6 years younger than I was. And when he was getting in trouble from my parents, he used to simply get a very placid look on his face and close his eyes. And if he was getting in trouble, he would just wait them out with a closed eyes. And I would watch, as an older brother does, with a kind of marvel at this technique this amazing closed eyes technique that my brother would use to get himself out of trouble. And in particularly, and this part was a little distressing to me, how effective it was, as opposed to my technique, which was to engage back and defend myself. My brother with his closed eyes seemed to work a lot better. Well, Canada has closed its eyes to its own jurisprudence in, I think, a really unhelpful way, but perhaps an effective one at creating a certain kind of loss of memory of what these cases are and what they stand for. Now I'll tell you another reason. Victor, should I stop there?
We're just beyond 5 minutes. So
then that's
a quick point, or is that
that's where I'll stop.
Okay. Well, that's already a lot to think about, and thanks for the image of a cascade of events. I really like that, and also, of course, the Korematsu case, which figured prominently in the post 9/11 detentions as well, and was really a source of concern, and, as you say, an anti-canon. So, but yeah, there's so much more to talk about. With that, let me turn the floor over to Jessica.
Thank you. I forgot to say, but I am actually a lawyer too. I trained in Mexico, and more recently I have become some sort of historian and sociologist, which are the main fields in which my research is drawing on. And so in response to Professor Ramja's question, Chapter 4 of my doctoral dissertation connects the histories of mestizo state violence with legal and unofficial practices of racism. It draws on the analysis of archival sources, memoirs, and oral life history interviews with surviving Issei and Nisei, who directly experienced World War II in Mexico. It demonstrates that the post-revolutionary Mexican state racialized Asians and Japanese as undesirable foreigners before World War II to expel them from the national body through various mechanisms, including the war concentration system, leading to the Mexican genocide of Asians from 1911 to the end of World War II. This genocide has been partly recognized by the Mexican state. However, this recognition is expressed in relation to the Chinese as a national group, eliding the ways in which Chino has been constructed historically and politically in Mexico as a racial category. My work argues that the Mexican state was the main actor in planning, ordering, and executing the unconstitutional displacement, concentration, and dispossession of between 6,000 and 16,000 people of Japanese origin in Mexico. This preliminary study exposes how the Mexican state deployed specific legal and unofficial practices of anti-Japanese racism to classify, control, and subordinate people of Japanese origin. From 1903, there were Pan-American eugenicist conferences that informed Mexican immigration committees on Asian migration. Japanese were required to obtain an identity card from the Registry of Foreigners, a policy that had seemingly neutral but racist underpinnings. In the 1930s, Mexican state migration agents and health population representatives advocated for the expulsion of Asians from the national body. One of the mechanisms they envisaged was the deployment of the concentration system of international wars to force Asians into unpaid agricultural labor before their expulsion. The Mexican post-revolutionary government enshrined in Article 33 of the 1917 Mexican Constitution the right of the Mexican president to expel inconvenient foreigners. The Mexican state used Article 33 as a political tool against anyone seen as foreigner and deemed undesirable. This article was used and abused by ordinary people to denounce those they deemed competitive, dislikable, or untrustworthy without evidence. Article 33 is not regulated in law, but has been applied by the Mexican Ministry of Interior, in particular, its Social and Political Department, hereafter DIPS. The order of concentration of the Japanese was issued prior to Mexico's formal declaration of war and suspension of rights. It was not even among citizens of enemy nations. It was a racist policy against people of Japanese ancestry based on their race. While Article 33 was invoked by the Mexican state to suspend the rights of enemy aliens, This article violates inalienable human rights enshrined in the Mexican Constitution. Among people of Japanese origin impacted by these measures, there were Mexicans by birth or naturalization who were entitled to constitutional protections and rights, including due process, presumption of innocence, and access to justice. The Mexican state coordinated national, local, and municipal governments, the Federal Army, and the Ministry of Interior's Population Department and DIPS. DIPS was an emergent state intelligence agency and state police which operated mostly with unprofessional and corrupt secret agents. During the concentration, the Mexican executive power and several Mexican state governors kept Mexican Japanese people in captivity and forced labor in their private ranches, working as slaves, in the words of many, without payment and disregarding their basic needs. The Mexican state also instrumentalized segments of the Japanese communities in order to carry out its policies of labor appropriation and elimination. The concentration led to a situation of rightlessness for people of Japanese origin in Mexico and their families. They experienced material, economic, and affective losses, including the confiscation of properties, separation of families, captivity, forced labor, impoverishment, lack of housing, food, and medical services, and unofficial killings and disappearances. After World War II, some Nisei were not allowed to obtain birth certificates from the civil registry, significantly limiting their political, social, and economic rights. Nisei were also forced to renounce their Japanese nationality at the risk of becoming stateless. In sum, the Mexican state created a context of oppression against the Japanese that led to intra-community tensions among Mexican Japanese, given the limitations on resources to subsist. As a result, there are varied and uneven experiences of the war. By implicating various actors, including Japanese and Mexican ordinary people, the Mexican state has concealed its state genocidal practices. Importantly, throughout this period, there were expressions of solidarity from several Mexican people who opposed the Mexican state concentration system. However, there has not been a redress or apology in Mexico.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for keeping to time. We're making good progress here, and some really interesting examples there, particularly in terms of the legal construction of race and the way it treats both race and questions of citizenship and belonging. And your research, I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary legal research, so I'm really happy to hear the perspective you bring. So thank you. With that, let's turn the floor over to Eric Mueller. Eric.
Thanks again. I've been fascinated to hear Jessica and Eric talk about the national situations in Canada and in Mexico. One thing that I hope to gain, frankly, from this project is a much deeper appreciation of the parallels and lack of parallels between the story of Japanese Americans, the legal history of Japanese American incarceration, and what was going on north and south of our border, as well as west of our border. One thing that I hope I can contribute maybe to the conversation is attention to efforts to try to think about these systems of oppression less monolithically. And what I mean by that, I actually think the example that the other Eric, the smarter Eric, shared is of the Korematsu case. Eric is exactly right. The Korematsu case is a dominant piece of American legal history generally, constitutional history. And it has come to define for American lawyers and law students and judges the entirety of, or sum up the experience of the Japanese American incarceration. But the Korematsu case it was only one of the cases before the United States Supreme Court. And it was actually not even about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. This is something that people don't actually mostly know. It was the Supreme Court sort of maneuvered the cases a little bit so that it could break the narrative of Japanese American removal and incarceration into segments. And the Korematsu case actually just considered the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. It said nothing purposely about what happened to them once they were removed, when they were placed into these American concentration camps. On the same day that the court decided Korematsu, it decided another case that nobody's ever heard of called Ex parte Endo, in which it unanimously concluded that the incarceration was unlawful and had to end. And so even if we think about Korematsu, it's the legal history is not monolithic. There's much more to look at. The agency that was responsible for the actual incarceration process was an agency called the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. Often when we think and people talk about the American story, they talk about what the government did to Japanese Americans, with the government always being this monolithic entity. But in fact, it's incoherent to speak about what the government did to Japanese Americans, because there was no such thing as the government. There was a series of agencies, each with its own vision, its own reporting lines of authority, each with its own mission, and each with its own background and views of Japanese Americans within their own jurisdictions, right? So the War Relocation Authority was actually just one of a multitude of agencies that whose activities impacted and injured Americans of Japanese ancestry and Japanese resident aliens in the United States. So there was no one government. We can shatter that monolith, and we should be thinking about it more granularly. But even there, I'm interested in breaking monoliths, because the War Relocation Authority itself was made up of individuals, individuals who brought their own perspectives, their own backgrounds, their own motivations, their own awarenesses, their own blindnesses to the project of actually operating this unjust system. And so I'm very interested in encouraging thought about the roles that individuals play. Often those roles are not really dictated by law. They're dictated by psychological and social forces that are change from moment to moment. So this is what I've been doing. My current book, which is going to be coming out probably about a year from now, is a book, as I said, about the lawyers who helped to run these camps. These were lawyers who occupied exquisitely conflicted positions. On the one hand, they were government lawyers, white government lawyers, whose job was to advise the camp administration on social control. But they were also, part of their job definition was to run a legal aid office to provide legal services and legal advice for the incarcerated Japanese Americans. The way these men, and they were all men at that time, the way they went about carrying out these parallel jobs in these isolated, mostly high desert, remote concentration camps were markedly different from one another. They were confronting the same problems, the same legal problems, the same problems of social control, but they were solving those problems in very different ways. And so I'm fascinated by trying to understand how that human element is such an important and often overlooked piece of, frankly, fuel for the engine of racial oppression. So that's really what I've been working on. My next projects are to look at the systems whereby Japanese Americans were stripped of their much of their property, and also, frankly, just to try to develop a history of the War Relocation Authority itself, a history that, shockingly, 80 years after it came into existence, has actually never been written. So I hope that was within my little time allotment, and that's what I'm working on. That's what I hope to maybe kind of share and develop some back and forth with folks about.
Thanks very much, Eric, and you managed to squeeze a lot into that session, and the complexity of, it's not just Korematsu, but a string of cases, the shattering of the monolithic state, and also, I think, really helpfully, the role of individual judgment and discretion. So those are all, I think, really important themes. So thank you for bringing them to the table. So with that, let's turn to our next speaker, Rainer.
Hello. Well, I'm very conscious, you know, that my presentation, my expertise is not sort of directly, you know, on the Nikkei experience. You know, although I'm a non-expert and know about what happened in Australia, but the relevance of that is I'm very conscious that what I have to say is in some ways somewhat dry. You know, just pointing out two features of, you know, I think that the legal context that I thought would perhaps most usefully contribute to today's discussion. So, you know, citizenship, legal membership is always in flux. It responds to changing conceptions of the state, international relations, membership and belonging. But, you know, that said, the 1940s in Australia and in other British Commonwealth countries, but I can speak most firmly for Australia, were a period of heightened flux and change regarding both the legalities and the extra legal realities of Australian membership. And there's just two aspects I'll pick up sort of in my 5 minutes that I think help give us some sense of the self-understanding of different actors in the 1940s. So Australian citizenship didn't exist until 1949. So there was no such status, and it was only when it was introduced by a statute coming into force in 1949 that it made sense to talk about Australian citizenship as a legal status. Before then, the relevant membership status was that of British subject, and it's about Nikkei as British subjects or aliens that the Australian materials on internment refer. It's not relevant for now, but I just note that British subject status continued to coexist with Australian citizenship right into the 1980s. So it wasn't as though there was just a neat handover from British subject status to citizenship. All right, so just the two features of the legal context of the 1940s that I think it's useful to draw attention to. First, legal membership with regards to immigration was deformalized in a way that it is not today. And I think that deformalization is important to understand a lot of what was going on. And second, what I wanted to highlight was the way in which there was distinctions between naturalized and birthright subjects in a way that's absent today. And so you have to recreate a system in which there was sort of basic inequalities relevantly for citizenship loss between naturalized and birthright. So first, on deformalization. So today we assume that legal membership, and I'm calling it that because I'm trying to historically have to traverse a large number of statuses, aligns with who's subject to immigration control and who isn't. So to take a really straightforward example, Section 6 of the Canadian Charter, rights to enter and remain in Canada, they're rights of citizens, they're citizenship rights. So citizenship and the extent of immigration control align. That wasn't the case, and it's important to understand that that was not the case in the Australian context. In the 1940s, you know, some British subjects, some people having the membership status were subject to immigration control and some were not legally. And so you have to look to another status for where the boundaries of immigration control are. What was that status? It was the status of immigrant as a legal status. Okay, why do we talk about immigrant as a legal status? Because the relevant head of federal legislative power was the immigration power. So it became, the relevant consideration was whether someone was an immigrant or not. Who determined who was an immigrant and how? Well, ultimately, it was the courts who determined who was an immigrant. And this is I'll finish the thought and then leave it. But the most important thing I want to get across is, you know, you could become a non-immigrant by absorption into the community without any action by the government. And so determining whether, and so move beyond the immigration power. And determining whether someone was or wasn't an immigrant was a question of fact, which was deliberated on by a court. And so it became a highly sort of subjective, you know, qualitative assessment of someone's degree of belonging. And it's that sort of deformalized subjective assessment of belonging that allowed space for some of the racialized conceptions that we see in the Nikkei episode to take place. So it's important to realize that some of the racialization of policy was taking place in relation to a deformalized legal status that denoted the boundaries of the immigration power. And the second point, which I think I can safely make much more briefly, is just about inequalities between naturalized and birthright. So in the pivotal decade in moving to equality between naturalized and birthright in Australia was the 1950s. So these events are happening before. What happened in the 1950s was that there was a removal of all sorts of special disabilities on ways in which naturalized citizens could lose their citizenship that didn't attach to birthright citizens. And those differences, with the exception of fraud, were all removed in 1955. But what we have at the time of the internments is we have sort of a sense in which naturalized citizenship or naturalized status is clearly inferior to birthright. And so when you're looking at some of the discussions about interning or removing naturalized citizens, there are all these distinctions which just you know, are strange to us today, but about sort of differentiating between the, usually in relation to Nikkei, but differentiating between the position of naturalized and birthright citizens. So just to summarize, two issues. One was the deformalization of the status that determined the bounds of the immigration power, and the other was sort of inequalities between naturalized and birthright citizens. And I think both of those are quite important to understanding a lot of sort of the official discourse around what was going on, certainly at the time. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Rainer, and thanks for putting those two issues on the table. And I can already start seeing some connections. Your work on citizenship and the way you think about it, and the racial categories reminded me of Jessica's earlier presentation. So I can look forward to seeing how these different conversations will connect. So now I'm going to show you the clip, the 13-minute clip. And as I said, this is sort of partly a presentation and then a sort of segue into the discussion that unfortunately Masumi will not be able to participate in directly, but let me see if I can continue with my earlier clip. Okay, there it goes. Search.
Sure. Yes. So I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce my work. So I authored 2 books, actually 3 books, but one book has the Japanese version and English version. That's why. So there are 2 books. So one is this one, The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law. Civil liberties debates from the internment to McCarthyism and the radical 1960s. So this book was published by the Temple University Press in 2019, and so that's one of the work that I do that I explained as before, based on my dissertation, and I deal with how the Japanese American internment or the forced removal and the incarceration left some legal legacy in the post-war United States civil liberties. So I will talk about it a little bit more after I introduce my second book, which is only in Japanese so far, but I'm hoping to also publish in English. And this one is Nikkei Kanadajin no Idou to Undo. So this translates into like, I have the English title already, which is Japanese Canadian Movement. And this book is actually like a comprehensive history of Japanese Canadians from the migration, like start of the migration in the late 19th century until the 21st century. I talk about like Asahi baseball team, how the families of the former immigrants reconnected in Japan, and then also reconnected families between Japan and in Canada. And that happened like very recently, you know, in the 21st century. So I wanted to write like a comprehensive history of Japanese Canadians, and I titled this book the Japanese Canadian movement, because this word movement has both meaning of migration and activism. Yeah, and so I tried to connect the pre-war migration and history with the post-war Japanese Canadian activism and movement, kind of, you know, connected these two historical narratives, which are not necessarily easy to put in one book. Yeah, so I wrote, okay, so movement will connect nicely with the pre-war history of Japanese migration, which is studied in a very different discipline, I guess, in different disciplines from the post-war analysis of you know, ethnic activism and cultural activism and stuff, things like that. So I looked at it, and I kind of put the transnational lens on top of it, and trying to put everything together in these chapters, and to write, to put all these stories related to Japanese Canadians in one book. And I think I kind of managed to do that. So I want to spend from April I'll be on sabbatical leave, so hopefully I'll have time to work on the translation, so that I can make the book available in English as well. So since today's talk is on the legal aspect of the Japanese North American or Japanese diaspora community's experience during World War II. So I want to mainly talk about the book on the American concentration camp law, what I call American concentration camp law, the Temple University Press book. I have been making a comparison between what happened in US and what happened in Canada. And basically in my other part of cultural historian part, I look at community activism and things like that. But also I wanted to explain or understand how Japanese American or Japanese Canadian forced removal and incarceration, and in Canadian case dispossession and deportation, those policies were possible under the existence of the US Constitution and also Canadian legal system. And as you know, I think many people already know that in Canada's case, there was War Measures Act, which basically gave the blank check, for the government to do anything they thought was necessary. So there was a very little kind of possibility of challenge to what the government did. And I'm sure that the session, and we will discuss this issue in more details, and other professors will talk about constitutional challenges and debates in Canada. In the US, what I did in my book was to look very closely, and I'm not a legal scholar, so I do more of a discourse analysis of the debates that happened during the war, how the government argued that this policy of removal and incarceration was constitutionally, justified. And also I looked at how the court manipulated the legal challenge, legal discourses that basically the court was in position to defend the governmental policy because it was during the wartime. That was sort of what they thought they had to do. So they manipulated these discourses.
Was that the Korematsu case?
Korematsu and other cases,
Okay.
yeah, combined. So I do a very close reading of Hirabayashi case, and
Right.
Hirabayashi and Korematsu and Endo cases. Yeah. So what I did was in the beginning. So how the government gave itself the power to remove people from the West Coast in the beginning. As many people know, it was done through Executive Order 9066, which basically gave usually when the government is dealing with citizens within the country, it's internal security branch of the government, which is the Department of Justice. Right? So the Department of Justice is responsible for the controlling the movement or the acts of citizens within a country. But what Executive Order 9066 did was to shift that power from the Department of Justice to the Department of War. So the military could make a decision to remove, to designate certain areas within the US territory as defense zones and remove people. Which the military thought was necessary. And the military said that any person of Japanese ancestry had to be removed from the defense zone, which was the 100-mile zone from the West Coast. But the interesting thing is the explanation of why this was constitutional. So in the beginning, the military report said that the Japanese were enemy race and there was potential danger of acts that could undermine the U.S. national security, but the War Department, the lawyers in the War Department, knew that would be unconstitutional if that only applies to Japanese as a racial group. So they changed the wording to, they didn't have time to differentiate between the loyal Japanese and disloyal Japanese because they were Japanese and they were culturally different. So they couldn't say they were racially different. So they said culturally different, and there was a very limited time to make this decision. So that's how the government explained its act. And later, because the government, the government and also the court at the end of the war wanted to close the camps and also get the people, reintegrate the people outside the camps. And they also had to make this argument that in the beginning, their decision was justified, but in the end, the Japanese Americans should be freed from the camps and be reintegrated. And also, many people were, serving in the military as well. So they said that, okay, so it was the loyalty issue. So they shift their argument again, that says from the enemy race to sort of culturally different people, and then to the Japanese Americans who were loyal, and because they were loyal and those people whose loyalty were proven, and then they should be freed. So that's how they try to justify all the policies in all these different phases. So what I argued was that this loyalty argument is sort of a double-edged sword, because when they say that Japanese Americans were loyal, therefore they should not be in the camps, and they do not constitute any threats for national security. So they should be, reintegrated. And many Japanese Americans also served in the military.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop it there just because I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for some cross engagement. So with apologies to Masumi, I think that gives you a sort of a sense of where she is in terms of her research, and I think we can already see some of the sort of themes, the cross-cutting themes. So at this point, I would like to invite the panelists to help us to identify those cross-cutting themes. I have notes of several, but I'd like to turn it over to you and see where you might see points of intersection and possible lines of inquiry or research that could come out of a collective project.
Well, if I can just jump in, there was one thing that really jumped out at me in what Rainer presented. I was so interested to hear your explanation of how this process, this sort of deregulation or decodification for the purposes of making determinations about who was a citizen or wasn't, or who wasn't, who had immigrant status or didn't, and the introduction into that of sort of tropes perhaps about foreignness or non-foreignness or Japanese-ness and Australian-ness. The reason that struck me so powerfully is that there was an almost inverse, but quite similar process in the American context, in which, for the purposes of making the loyalty determinations that Masumi was just talking about, the government codified a system of making that, so turned it into law, took something that might have been a discretionary judgment and turned it into something that was more like a code that assigned people point values based on certain very basic and almost ridiculous characteristics that were either seen as Japanesey or Americanish. So, you would gain points if you played on a little league baseball team, but if you did judo after school, you would lose points. So I'm very interested to learn more about the thing that you described, in the sense that it both parallels and directly opposes the system for loyalty adjudication that went on in the United States.
Maybe I'll just jump in by way of sort of just short response. One thing I was conscious of, because the American experience is the most well known. I was thinking, when I was sort of looking at the Australian material, well, I have to be careful that I don't present sort of formalization as the solution, of the status, because that directly runs into the American experience. I wasn't sort of so much actually thinking of the loyalty process, although that's probably a better example. But just some of the formalities around American citizenship. So very briefly, what I would say is, I think some degree of formalization of citizenship status is sort of necessary but not sufficient. And I suppose just as a point for possible discussion either today or subsequently, I say it's necessary or not, but not sufficient. But I also think that if I had to sort of jump one way or the other, I would say that a formalized process or formalization on the whole is more resistant to, can be more effectively resistant to racialization or prejudice than the deformalized process. And that's sort of one of the central things. So of course I'd have to qualify that, and the American example sort of immediately pulls me up on that. But I think there is an underlying thing that in Australia, the move to formalization of citizenship has paralleled in not completely contingent ways the sort of the removal of racial prejudice. Of course, you can still have it in a formalized system, but I think it works against it.
Right. Very interesting.
Maybe I'll jump in, Victor, in terms of common themes or places where I see interesting links is state racism at the national level as the international level is at least rhetorically moving in exactly the opposite direction. So all of these countries in the 1940s have a common enemy in Nazi Germany and know that rhetorically racism is at a low ebb, that the second half of the 20th century is going to be defined by an attempt to eradicate, the most pernicious forms of discrimination as a result of the Nazi experience. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Atlantic Charter, all of that experience out of the kind of late 1940s puts rights and discrimination and racism in a different register. And alongside of that international conversation continues to be this national racialized and racist projects. So what is the relationship between doing racism in an international context in which nation states are also giving up racism? And that's, I think, a challenge that they confront. And the legal form in some ways maybe helps them operationalize or rationalize that challenge. I wonder if the law becomes a mechanism through which you can still do racist things while also claiming to be part of an unracist future.
Thanks, Eric. That's great. And actually, that's an interesting segue into Jessica's presentation. Jessica, I wonder if I could put you on the spot and ask you to maybe comment or respond or maybe take things in a different direction. But I hear some echoes in Eric Adams's comments to your presentation. So do you want to take that up? You're muted. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, well, perhaps many of you have not heard much about Mexican history, but in 1910, Mexico had a cultural revolution. So it was driven by ideals of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, even though paradoxically it reasserted racism and racial logics and thinking. So there is a drive in Mexico towards challenge injustices, past injustices of colonization and so on. And at the same time, so formally, as Professor Adams was mentioning, formally Mexico is trying to keep face and to appear as revolutionary and socialist and as advancing social rights of indigenous peoples and other peoples in Mexico. But it was also orchestrating the elimination of Asians. So in this period, Asians become the main target of the Mexican revolutionary state. And by Asians, I mean everyone who could be racialized as Asian, Chinese, Japanese, also Koreans, and so on. And so Mexico had to come up with some kind of more unofficial practices, and these were called circulares. So these were kind of secret memos that were circulating across different body entities to enact racist measures against different groups, in particular the Japanese, as I tried to explain in my presentation. So there is this kind of paradoxical or kind of duplicitous stance of the Mexican state at the international level, in which it is trying to appear more egalitarian and anti-colonialist, but also the internal dynamics that the revolution fosters, which are very xenophobic and racist at the time. So I do see that in the case that I examined. I also found another similarity with Professor Izumi's work about how the War Measures Act gave blanket power to the executive power, and they did not need the approval from the parliament. And this is something that also happens in Mexico with the application of Article 33 by the executive power, which did not require legislative or popular consultation on that basis. And I suppose I'll just conclude this intervention by mentioning that while there are many similarities between the cases that we have all explained today that I have found, it also seems to me that most of these discussions draw on analytical frameworks that have been constructed based on the US or kind of European experience, even the experience of Japanese Americans. And these analytic frameworks are very useful to think about the concentration of Japanese people in Mexico, because they reflect the continuities that we are trying to trace, but also they also bring to the foreground the dominance of the US in relation to the rest of the Americas. And in contrast to what Professor Eric Mueller wrote in the piece that we perhaps read today, that Michael Abe kindly shared, whereas the US doesn't seem to take a lot of interest in what happens in other countries, Mexico, because of its colonial position and subordinated position in relation to the US, takes a lot of interest in what happens in the US. And this means that most of our debates are framed to fit into US narratives, and these may obscure the specificities of other contexts like Mexico, where there is a history of imperial projects and intercolonial projects and kind of palimpsestic formations of race. So yes, so I suppose there is that tension between the usefulness and also the difficulties of addressing these continuities and differences. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. That's really interesting. And that last point on the American influence. I'm curious if I could just ask you about, in terms of the legal context in Mexico, I guess there's a bit of a civil law, European Spanish legacy. How does that figure in? Does that make a difference to the way in which these sort of legal issues are framed, or the way in which, say, categories are constructed or emergency powers are understood?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very glad that you're asking that question, because that's something I wanted to say, but I didn't find the time before. And yes, Mexico has a hybrid legal system, which is based on civil law. It combines Roman and Germanic traditions with more recent adaptations of the Anglo-American common law that since the 2000s have integrated oral trials, for example. And the 1917 Mexican Constitution is inspired by the US federal system and division of powers. And these kind of adaptations of different legal systems inform the ways in which the Mexican legal and unofficial practices justify the unjust war concentration system during the Second World War. These kind of histories also inform mestizaje, which is this racial regime that I explained before. And so we can see that in the Mexican case, the racialization of the Japanese is connected not only to US-led immigration restrictions and racism that spread in the Americas as a whole, but also they reflect previous colonial histories of the Spanish Empire in Mexico and the Mexican enslavement of Asians since the 16th century to the 18th century. So these cumulative histories have informed the ways in which Asians have been constantly positioned in a subordinated role. Yes, and they inform different kind of overlapping racisms there.
Thanks, Jessica. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on these points. Otherwise, I have one maybe forward-looking question for you all. Any panelists want to come in? No? Okay, so I guess the other question, and we received a few sort of inquiries before this session from some participants. So I don't know if the person who sent this question is on the call. But I'm wondering if we look forward and sort of to the legacies of the Japanese, Canadian, American, Mexican, Australian experiences, right? And you know, how liberal democracy has responded, and the measures that were the sort of reflection and the measures that were put in place to as liberal democracies to avoid these kinds of problems in the future. What is the legacy? I mean, when we think about, for instance, the response to 9/11 or current issues around, say, anti-Asian discrimination and racism in different parts of the world after, you know, COVID-19, and there were all kinds of racist incidents. How do we understand the legacy? What have liberal democracies learned from the wrongs? And I guess I'm thinking here about the way Jordan is framing the project, right? The past choices and past wrongs and future choices. So thinking ahead and looking at the responses, do you have any thoughts?
I'll jump in and comment very briefly. Sure. And I wanted in part to pick up on something that Eric Adams said earlier about the Korematsu case and the way in which it has become part of the anti-canon, as he said, you know, sort of one of the handful of definitionally awful Supreme Court cases that are illustrations of when the court went horribly, horribly wrong. That's true about the Korematsu case, but there is an unfortunate simultaneous effect when something becomes part of the anti-canon, and that is that it becomes an example of something that we don't do anymore. Right, so we are able to tell ourselves, oh, the Korematsu case, yeah, that was awful. That's something that would never fly today. But then, you know, a couple of years ago, when Donald Trump announces that people from Muslim majority countries are not going to be able to come into the United States, the Supreme Court, in referencing Korematsu, says, oh, well, this case is totally different from that, right? This is Korematsu, that was awful, and that was a case of moving citizens around on the basis of race and confining them. But this is very different and not implicating of the values that the court got so wrong in Korematsu. So I worry quite a bit that something about, in a certain sense, just in the way that the Holocaust is a kind of conversation stopper, right? Nothing can be compared to that. And so, you know, anything that goes on that is reminiscent of those mechanisms is cast aside as not worthy of serious concern because it's not that big bad thing. I worry some about the ways in which the histories that we all study get sort of shelved in a certain way as a kind of racism that we've moved beyond when, at least in the American context, there's ample evidence that even just in terms of violence on the streets of our cities being directed against Asian Americans, that we haven't moved beyond it at all. And that's to say nothing of government policy like some of those that were enacted by the Trump administration.
Thanks, Eric. And that's a sobering reminder that we need to think more about the legacies and maybe try to learn a little bit more from what's happened in the past. Rainer, I'm not sure if you were about to come in, but I just want to say that we have about 5 minutes left. We have quite a large audience, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to questions, but I would invite you, in case the panelists are interested, or maybe Jordan and his growing team, if you are interested in just sort of putting in the chat some of the themes that you've observed, or some of the sort of questions or commonalities that you've seen in this discussion, I think that would be really helpful. If you do have a burning question, please raise your electronic hand, just your little yellow hand, and I'll see if we have time to get to you. But it would be great if you are interested in adding those comments to the chat. I assume John, I don't know if you're on the line and if the chat is open, but if you could open it, that would be great.
Yep.
Okay, so back to Rainer in the meantime.
No, I don't want to cut into anyone's time, but I just thought, you know, Eric was sort of saying how in, you know, like his brother's impassive face when being told off, sort of Canada had just shut down on the legacy. And I just wanted to say, you know, very briefly, Australia is an even more extreme case in that, you know, it was a much smaller population, but almost the entirety of it was deported. And it just is almost forgotten for most people, other than sort of people who focus on it specifically as part of in the general consciousness. And then the only other thing I wanted to just pick up on Jessica's point, which is that part of what will be involved in the process is just looking at the very different ways in which sort of you know, ideas about race and racialization, the different forms they take in the different countries, you know, which was something that I think Jessica usefully drew attention to, and will be something that sort of the comparative project will have to look at. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rainer. Anyone else? I'm not seeing any hands going up, so if any of the panelists has anything more to say, and then I might, Jordan, I'm putting you on notice that I might ask you to give us your reflections for a couple of minutes and any sort of next steps you have in mind. I'm not seeing any hands or anything in the chat. So Jordan, we've got about 3 minutes left, and let me give you most of those 3 minutes before I thank everyone. So over to you.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, just scribbling notes throughout. I found the presentations really enlightening and helpful. I ended up with 3 questions in that kind of cross-cutting segment where you asked the panelists to talk across to one another. I ended up with the first question of how citizenship is made in law, and as part of that, Rainer and Eric, I would say Mueller, so I'd be saying Mueller.
Sorry, my apologies.
And I have questions around that as well from the Canadian context. And then the second question, which I think Eric Adams first put to us, although he more specifically perhaps than this, how do impulses or practices towards anti-racism intersect with ongoing racist legal forms? And then the third, following on Jessica's comment, just how we bring these cases into conversation with one another, and what kinds of dominant analytic themes might spill from one into another. I think that's a really interesting question to ponder as well. And then there were a few others that followed after, but you know, as far as next steps, I was envisioning putting those 3 questions out to the team, trying to encourage these legal scholars to keep working together, and like you said, to build a research community where maybe together some of these very fine scholars we heard from today will help us to start to answer some of these questions that cut across their work. So thanks again to all the panelists.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks to you and Mike and all of your colleagues who had input in bringing us all together. My thanks, my sincere thanks to the panelists. That was a really interesting discussion. Eric, Jessica, Eric, Mueller, and Rainer, and Masumi, who I think is listening in. Really, my thanks for a terrific discussion. I think, as Jordan has demonstrated, there's a lot that's come out of this. I think there's huge scope for this to turn into a really interesting comparative project. And I hope we will be able to see many of you here in Victoria when circumstances permit. And I'm sure I'm going to offer on Jordan's behalf that Jordan will take us all out for a very nice meal. So my thanks to all of you. I see there's a lot going on in the chat. So John, if you could just save that. I think there might be some things and ideas and thoughts that well, we might want to capture. So with that, have a good afternoon, evening, morning, and hope to see you all again in person. Oh, and thanks, of course, to all of the participants and for your comments. And I'm sorry if there was a question that I missed. Thanks, and take care. Bye-bye, everyone.